The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the American Probation and Parole Association's webinar session on the role of community corrections in serving victims of crime. My name is Carrie Abner, and I'm a research associate with APPA. I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's session. This is the first webinar in a series on victim issues in community corrections being delivered by the American Probation and Parole Association through funding from the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted to the APPA website in coming weeks. I would like to go over a couple of quick items before we get started with today's discussion. All participants will remain muted during the webinar to avoid any feedback or background noise that could be distracting to the presentation. However, we may ask you a few questions throughout the presentation using features of GoToWebinar. To answer any such questions, you may click on the appropriate response on the left side of your screen. So let's start with an example question. I'd like to find out a little bit about who we have participating today. Please tell us what kind of professional role you play: probation, parole, pretrial services, justice system-based victim advocate, or community-based victim advocate. Excellent. It looks like we mainly have probation folks here today, also some parole, a few pretrial services, as well as both victim, community-based and justice system-based victim advocates. All right. Well, thank you so much for participating in this little poll. Also, if you have a question for our presenter during today's session, you could submit that question via the chat feature. Simply type in your question, and we will reserve some time at the end of the presentation today to answer any questions that have been submitted. Also, should you have any technical difficulties accessing today's webinar presentation, including any problems hearing or seeing the presentation, you may also let us know that through the chat and messaging feature. We will try to answer technical questions as we are able throughout the presentation via chat. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome today's speaker, Ann Seymour. Ann has been a national crime victim advocate for 30 years and specializes in victims' rights and services in institutional and community corrections and reentry. She is a founding member of the American Probation and Parole Association's Victims Issues Committee, the American Correctional Association's Victims and Restorative Justice Committee, and the Association of Paroling Authorities International's Victims Committee, and also serves on the advisory board of the National Institute of Corrections and is a consultant to the Pew Center on the State's Public Safety's Performance Project to proactively engage survivors and advocates in corrections reform and justice reinvestment initiatives. She has been and continues to be a trailblazer for the victims' rights movement nationwide and has fought tirelessly at all levels for the recognition and implementation of the rights of those victimized by crime. We are really thrilled to have Ann Seymour here today to talk about the role that probation, parole, and other community corrections professionals and agencies can and should be playing to better serve victims of crime. Ann, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I want to thank everyone today. I know y'all are busy folks and you've squeezed an hour in to learn a little bit about community corrections and victims. I also want to thank the Office for Victims of Crime and APPA, who have partnered for over 20 years to really make victims part of the things that community corrections can do throughout the entire criminal justice system, but particularly in the post-sentencing phases of victims' cases. And next slide, please. Today we have 3 learning objectives. I want to talk quite a bit about the impact of crime on victims, but in particular what it means to folks in community corrections, why understanding victim impact is essential to be able to do your job well. We're going to talk a bit about the most common rights of victims recognized by state and federal legislation. And then our roundup at the end, the real meat and potatoes, is really talking about the role of community corrections in implementing victims' rights, but also partnering with victim advocates to make sure that victims get the services that they need. Next slide, please. Starting off with just recognizing community corrections should be very concerned about how crime affects victims, recognizing that criminal activity and being a victim is very stressful. We ask victims to think and discuss in detail what happened to them at the time the crime occurred and thereafter, very often in front of juries, courtrooms, people they don't know. Very often they have to once again face the alleged, or after conviction, the convicted perpetrator in court and community corrections, which can be very, very frightening. And as you all know, I think community corrections is a process that a lot of victims don't understand, and they may not be willing participants in the community corrections process. So it's important to understand these points as we talk about victim assistance. Next slide, please. If you identify and address victim impact, it can really enhance victims' capacity to cooperate and to really have a more effective participation as witnesses. And I think we all know if we don't have victims participating as witnesses, we frankly don't have much of a criminal justice system. The third point is, to me, the most important. Very often victims' perception of the justice process is very, very low, very, very poor. And if we understand victim impact and address it, it makes victims, I think, appreciate the criminal justice system quite a bit more. It's also important if we help victims particularly deal with the impact and the trauma of victimization, it can improve the victim input through impact statements and also their capacity to seek services. And the last one is one that I think is very important. It enhances victims' capacity to give you information that is important to effective offender management. If we listen to victims and identify what they know about the crime and also about their own needs, it's going to make offender management much more effective in the long run. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk today about 4 basic impacts that victims tend to go through: psychological, physical, spiritual, and financial. And I want to start out by saying every case is unique and every victim is unique. So the level of impact is going to be different for every victim based upon their circumstances prior to the crime, but also on how they are affected by these 4 impacts after the crime occurs. Next slide, please. We tend to talk about emotional and psychological impact a lot. In the victims field, we call that the social wound. It ends up resulting with a lot of victims having problems with relationships, and not just family and personal relationships, but sometimes it's difficult for them to have a relationship with helping professionals, including community corrections and victim advocates. Many victims make significant changes in their lifestyle, and they restrict and change their behavior after being a victim. They may not go out at night. They may barricade their house and their place of employment as never before just to make themselves feel safer. And for a lot of victims, unfortunately, they have significant changes in their pre-victimization beliefs about the world, that the world is a safe place, that bad things don't happen to good people. And these are things that we need to understand because they affect how the victim is going to how the victim is going to act in the aftermath of crime, and it's going to affect whether or not they seek assistance and services. And the last one I think is important. There's a lot of research that says once you are a victim, particularly of a violent crime, and particularly in cases where the victim is very traumatized, it does increase the risk of future victimization. So that's something we need to be very, very concerned about. Next slide, please. So manifestations of emotional and psychological impact, they can happen right after the crime occurs. They can be triggered by being in a courtroom or a community corrections process and seeing the offender again. It's sort of like an ebb and flow, if you will. Victims often suffer shock and disbelief and denial, and shock in particular that this has happened and it's happened to me. Some victims become very preoccupied with the crime, and I know a lot of you have had experiences where victims really want to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about what happened. And our role is to be able to listen and validate that what they went through was a very bad thing. Victims may be very, very anxious, and they may or may not look distressed. As a victim advocate, I've gotten very used to asking victims, is there anything in your life right now that is causing you distress? And it's a great question to ask to sort of get a sense for where they are in that time and place. The disturbed concentration is one that really has a profound effect on on being able to help victims, but also on their capacity to be witnesses in cases. When a victim cannot concentrate and a police officer is interviewing them, or in the courtroom or in a corrections proceeding, we're asking them a lot of questions where they can't concentrate. It may be very difficult for them to talk about what happened and to be able to say the same thing repeatedly over and over again in the same way. So that's something to be very concerned about. And they also, very often, they just don't feel safe. And a big role of community corrections is identifying victim safety needs and working with victim advocates to address them. And the last one, there's just a lot of research in our field that tells us that victims have concerns about who to tell, including reporting to law enforcement, telling their family, telling their friends. They have a lot of concerns about being believed and about being blamed, and a lot of victims tend to blame themselves for what happened, and we still live in a society that still has tinges of victim blaming. So it's something that we need to be very, very aware of when we're working with crime victims. Next slide, please. There is a wide range of physical impacts that victims may go through, ranging from minor physical injuries to very serious injuries to injuries that affect their entire life, require rehabilitation. It may put them in a wheelchair. It may cause them to have permanent disabilities. And some of the injuries that you can see and some that you can't see may cause discomfort to victims in court and in community corrections process, and it may affect a victim's stamina. So being aware by reading the case file, by talking to the victim, by making sure that community corrections is compliant with the Americans with Disability Act, all of these are important things that can help us address the physical impact of crime. Next slide, please. The spiritual impact is something that has received a lot of attention in the victim assistance field. We live in a very diverse nation, and I think we're all blessed because of that. There are many, many different faiths that are practiced in the United States today, and so having just a basic knowledge about the different faiths is really, really important as community corrections and victim assistance professionals. Equally important is to really separate our faith, our beliefs, from those of the victims. It is not our place to be able to talk about our perspective from our spiritual beliefs. It's really trying to focus on what theirs are. And victim spiritual beliefs can absolutely directly affect his or her decision to even participate in court or corrections processes. And so sometimes there may be faiths that preclude a victim from even wanting to report crimes, especially when the crime is committed by someone known to them. And there's a lot of wonderful training in the field, wonderful training from the Office for Victims of Crime that helps us understand the different faith perspectives that may affect a victim's willingness to participate in justice processes. So I would really encourage you to be aware of that training and to get it. Next slide, please. The financial impact of crime, the first bullet says it all. It can be actually devastating. And I always think back to a man I met in California whose old car was stolen. And after his car was stolen, he couldn't get to work, so he lost his job. He didn't have a job, and so he ended up having his house foreclosed on. He was broke, he was destitute, and to add insult to injury, his wife left him. And I give you that example because, in a court or corrections process, you would say the guy lost his old junker car. From the victim's personal perspective, it messed up his entire life. So being aware that there's a significant financial impact, and in most states victim compensation is available only to violent crime victims, and we're going to talk later about restitution because that's very, very important in terms of helping in particular victims who suffer property crimes to be able to recuperate from the sometimes significant financial losses that results from that. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit now about crime victims' rights, and I'm going to focus specifically on the rights that occur for victims in the post-sentencing phases of their cases primarily. We'll touch a little bit on pretrial and court processes, but I really want to focus on community corrections. Next slide, please. A lot of people are surprised to find out there are over 32,000 laws that define victims' rights and protect their rights at the federal, state, and tribal levels. When I'm doing trainings and I ask people how many laws are there, they tend to say like 110. So there's 32,000 laws. The good thing is that we have lots of good laws. The challenge we face is that many times these laws are not fully implemented. We also have in 33 states constitutional amendments that strengthen victims' rights, and in some of these states, such as Colorado and Wisconsin, they actually have processes where if a victim's right is not observed, they have processes where they can file a formal complaint and see about getting their rights implemented. I would direct you all to OVC's wonderful victim law, to the URL there. You can find laws in your states by your state, by the type of law, 4 different ways to be able to access information about your laws. And I would encourage you to be very, very familiar with laws in your states, and also work with victim advocates, because they have victims' laws imprinted on their brains, and I think a lot of them would be very willing to provide you with information about victims' rights. Next slide, please. So I want to talk first about information and notification. In the victim assistance field, we call victim notification the threshold right. If victims know about their rights and how to access them, it opens up major, major doors for them to be able to more effectively participate in justice processes and also implement their other rights. In community corrections, these rights keep victims informed about the status of their case and the status of their offender. Why is this important? When an offender is in jail or in detention or incarceration, the victim has a greater sense of security because the person is incarcerated. When they're back in the community, the victim wants to know what's going on. And so to the degree possible, we need to be able to provide them with information that can help them plan their lives and hopefully make them feel a little bit safer. The good news is that most states have automated victim notification systems. And at the national level, I'm actually involved in a project sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and NCJA that promotes statewide automated victim information and notification systems. We have a Save It Online community, and this URL has an amazing virtual library that has hundreds and hundreds of very good documents about victim information and notification. And I would encourage you, once this is posted on APPA's website, to go ahead and access the Savin Online community. Next slide, please. Victims have rights to participate throughout the entire spectrum of the criminal justice system, from pre-trial, being notified and being able to participate in bail and other release hearings, trial, whether or not they're a witness, and at sentencing to be able to attend and participate and do victim impact statements. And for community corrections, very important, if there are parole hearings or revocation hearings, victims in all states have rights to attend and to participate and to be able to give victim impact statements that we'll talk about in a minute. So participation is one of the core rights that victims truly, truly value. Next slide, please. Victim input is very, very essential, and a little history on this. The victim impact statement was actually started in Fresno County, California years and years ago by the then Chief Probation Officer Jim Rowland, who said that he was sort of shocked by the fact that you would hear so much from the convicted offender and his or her family and friends, and he talked about the sound of silence on the other side of the courtroom where the victims should have been. And so he created what we know as a victim impact statement. And today, and it varies in states, victims have the right to submit impact statements, either written, they can do it orally in court or at parole hearings, they can submit video montages, audio. In a couple of states, they can have teleconferences so they don't actually have to travel miles and miles to a hearing. And we have wonderful special victim impact statements that are commensurate with children's age and cognitive ability, and for surviving family members of homicide, which these statements are a little bit different from the standard victim impact statement. We can also get victim input through PSI reports and pre-parole investigations, and in some states now, and I'll do a shout out to Minnesota, when an offender is going through the reentry process, they actually get a reentry statement from victims. And I want to just talk briefly about victim impact statement or any of these processes, it's important to ask victims describe the offense and how it affected them, because the victim's depiction of what happened, as you know, might be quite different from the version that the offender has in your case file. We want to ask them about the things that we talked about earlier, the emotional and physical, financial and psychological impact, and we want to ask them specifically if they have concerns for their safety and security and whether or not we can help them address those concerns through some protective measures that we're going to talk about in a minute. I like to ask victims, what do you want to happen now? That's my favorite question in victim impact statements, because it's an open-ended question that lets them really think and really tell me what's important to them. So those are some of the essential things that we look at in victim input. And the other thing, when you gather information in victim input through any of these processes on this slide, it is very, very helpful in improving offender management, and in particular in holding offenders accountable, because the information you often will have in a case file, if it doesn't include the victim's perspective of what happened and how they were affected, you are missing half the ball on this. And so reading this information and using it for offender management is just something that I encourage you all, if you're not already doing it, to put that into your little toolbox. Next slide, please. Victim safety is just paramount to everything that we do. I really believe that a lot of victims do not report crimes and participate in justice and corrections processes out of sheer fear of the perpetrator. Sometimes it's actual fear because they have been threatened, and sometimes it's just perceived fear because they are traumatized as a victim. So we want to be able to identify through the victim impact statement, through talking to them, any needs they have and anything we can do to protect them from unwanted contact and harassment and harm. We need to be able to make victims aware of protective orders that they can get, and also to notify victims when the protective orders are received by the offender, which can be a very dangerous time for some victims. And I think one of the most important things that community corrections folks can do is to partner with victim advocates on safety planning. And I've worked in a number of states. West Virginia comes to mind, where we did collaborative training with, in particular, domestic violence and sexual assault advocates with parole agents throughout the state to develop a protocol for safety planning that isn't a victim gig. It's not a community corrections gig. It's a partnership where they are able to address the victim's needs for safety, but also to be able to hold the offender accountable if he violates any of the victim's protective needs. And so I would encourage you to consider collaborative safety planning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. Restitution, those of you who have heard me speak, I call it the black hole of victims' rights. If I was going to look at the major categories of victims' rights and say where we have not failed miserably but failed somewhat, it is absolutely restitution. I think it has to be a key tenet of offender accountability. And the fact that in community corrections, in a lot of jurisdictions, we are willing to end a probation and parole where there are still legal financial obligations is pretty shocking to me. And to a lot of victims, it's very hurtful because of the financial impact that we talked about earlier. It's important that we, either in community corrections or in victim services, help victims document all of their financial losses. And where we need a lot of work, and I think you're probably nodding your heads at wherever computer you're sitting at now, we need systems that are established to order and collect and distribute restitution payments to victims. And that is where we are woefully negligent. Community corrections plays a super duper important role and working with offenders to be able to stress why restitution is important to the victims. I don't know a whole lot of offenders who get that without really having a sit down with their community corrections officer to be able to identify the very often significant financial losses that they caused. And the other thing is that a lot of creative stuff going on to improve opportunities to help offenders make timely payments. And that may be the good work that you do in finding employment for offenders, offenders and doing financial management classes. It may be doing personal assessments to see if they smoke cigarettes, if they have hunting and fishing licenses, if they have cable TV. And when you add all of these things up, if you can take away those little fluffy things that they don't absolutely need, that can fulfill their restitution obligations. And the final one to me, I think, is also very important. It's looking at making our enforcement of restitution meaningful. And to me, that just becomes a point of recognizing that I know a lot of offenders say that they cannot afford to pay their restitution obligations. I think it's important to emphasize that there are a lot of victims who cannot afford to pay for the losses that the offenders caused, And so anything we can do to hold offenders feet to the fire and really keep on them to make their restitution payments, and as I said earlier, to help them to the degree possible in fulfilling their legal financial obligations. This is one of the most significant things that community corrections can do to help victims, and I would also say to be able to help offenders. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier, but it's important to know about victim compensation. It's a wonderful program that all states have that's available for victims of violent crime who report the crime and cooperate with the prosecution of the crime. In community corrections, my tip is to just be aware of the laws in your state. They do vary state to state. You have wonderful victim compensation programs and claims administrators that work with victims to be able to help them recuperate some of the financial losses resulting from crime that we talked about earlier. And the other thing is to be able to make referrals to crime victims. You may not see a victim till months after a crime occurs, but if they haven't filed a comp claim, you can go to this website. This is the National Association of Crime Victim Compensation Boards. Click on your state and it will take you directly to your compensation website, and I would bookmark that and be familiar with it when you're dealing with violent crime victims, because I'm always surprised to know how many of them were not aware of this right, and it's just a gift to them to be able to help them recuperate financially from the crime that occurred. Next slide, please. So when you talk about victims' rights, again, remember there's 32,000 of them, so there's lots and lots of rights that we have to be concerned about. It's important that we do a few things to help victims implement their rights and to be able to assist them in accessing services. I think first and foremost, we need to be able to explain the community corrections process. And when you think about it, we call it community corrections, probation, parole, reentry. And if you talk to victims, they don't know the difference between those four and whatever else we're calling it. And they don't understand how it works. And so to be able to explain it or have on your website information or a print brochure that talks very, very simply about the community corrections process, in particular victims' rights and what is happening with the offender in terms of, in particular, trying to keep them on the straight and narrow and preventing them from causing further victimization, and to be able to help victims understand that process and where they fit in that process. That's probably the number one thing I advise community corrections folks to do. A thing that we're getting a lot better at now is to give the victim information about who is supervising the offender in the community, and to be able to tell the victim if you have any problem that's not an emergency. In an emergency situation, advise them to dial 911, of course, but to feel free to call the supervising officer to say if you have had unwanted contact, to say that you have not received a restitution payment, to say that I would like to attend the probation revocation hearing. This is very, very important to have that direct contact and that relationship. We talked starting off today about being able to notify the victim of changes in the case and upcoming hearings or any other case-related events. And if you go to, for example, justicesolutions.org, there's a list of case-related events. I think there's 74 different events that victims have the right to participate in, and about half of those are specific to community corrections. Victims, not all victims, but a lot of them want to know what's going on and they want to participate. So just being able to tell them what's coming up and to engage them proactively becomes a very significant part of what community corrections folks can do to assist victims. Next slide, please. We need to be able to facilitate victim input through all of the processes that we talked about earlier. And there are just a lot of resources available through APPA and other venues that can help you develop very good victim impact statements, very good forms for PSIs and PPIs, and as I mentioned in Minnesota, reentry statements, so that we're getting the information from the victim in a way that's most amenable to them. And we talked about the different processes earlier. I think a super important thing is to be aware of victim services and the wide range of other services that can help them in the community. And I always laugh because it's not that different from the services that we provide offenders. Victims often need transportation, they need housing, they need assistance with employment, they need to be able to attend a support group. Very much the things that we do for offenders, we in the victim assistance field do very similar things for crime victims. So being aware of victim services is critical, and to be able to make good referrals to victims from both community and system-based victim advocates. And there's over 10,000 victim assistance programs in the country. It's a little bit overwhelming, and I'm sort of proud of that number, but it's also important to be able to find the ones in your community. I always refer people to the OVC online directory because you can go to this website and you can identify victim services by the type of service, by the type of criminal victimization, by your zip code, by your state or jurisdiction. It's very, very user-friendly. And I would ask you, when you get your list of, in a mid-sized community, there'll be 25 victim assistance programs. Don't just have the list and make referrals. I would call the programs up and try to do brief meetings with them, and we'll talk a little bit later about cross-training, but always have a point of contact so that you can call someone when you're making a referral for victims, or give the victim a name and not just an agency. It makes a world of difference in them being able to assist victims. And the other thing is, in community corrections, I mean, years ago I had a probation officer say, you're basically asking me to double my caseload. You want me to work with the offender and work with the victim. Well, in doubling your caseload, you need to know that victim advocates and victim assistance professionals have your backs, and we really are willing and even eager to partner with you on being able to, once you've identified victims, being able to provide them with support in concert with you. And I think that's very, very important. If we look at these types of collaborations, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Next slide, please. The other good news is that increasingly in probation and parole, and even in reentry, a lot of community corrections agencies have specialized units. And I have personally worked over the years, and APPA has provided amazing leadership in helping to provide a training and policy and protocol development for specialized units to address crimes like domestic violence and sexual assault and drunk driving. And back in the day, there were a lot of community corrections agencies that actually had their own victim advocates. With budget cutbacks, unfortunately, those were some of the first staff to go. But you know, check in your jurisdiction. Do you have a victim advocate within your community corrections agency? Because these become the folks that can help you liaison with victim services. The reason Ann Seymour loves specialized units is that it makes it so much easier for the victim. Anything I can do to ease the process of a victim accessing services is a really, really important thing. So the victim knows they can contact the supervising officer. Instead of making 3 or 4 phone calls, there's one person they can contact, and they can be pretty confident that, for example, if they contact the supervising officer in the domestic violence unit, that that person is aware of evidence-based strategies, not just for offender management, but for the impact of domestic violence on victims and on their children. So these are folks who it sort of ups the ante in terms of their professional capacity to be aware of the impact on victims and to be able to help identify and meet their needs. The other thing that is wonderful, and I think many of you have participated in, there's a lot of focused training for staff and cross-training with professionals allied professionals and victim services on drunk driving, on sexual assault, on domestic violence, where we can really, again, not to overstress the importance, but we can really focus on what we know works in identifying and meeting both the needs of victims and the needs of people who perpetrate these crimes. So as you can see, I am head cheerleader for specialized units, and again, APPA, Carrie's going to talk a little bit later about some of their wonderful programs, but they've got lots of good stuff on specialized services for victims. Training is one of the most essential things that we can do for community corrections folks. And if I was just going to tell you sort of the basic things that you need to be aware of, it is what we talked about earlier, victim statutory, and in 33 states, what are their constitutional rights, and the role of community corrections in helping victims exercise their rights. First and foremost, making sure they're aware of them, and second, really being aware of community corrections' role in things like notifying victims and helping them feel safe with protective orders, and encouraging them through the use of victim impact statements, and of course I can never say enough about legal financial obligations like restitution and child support. Community corrections just plays such a significant role, and I thank you all who have fulfilled that role, because victim advocates and survivors really appreciate that. The other thing is training, and you got a little Cliff Notes version today, but training about the impact of crime on victims and how it affects their participation in community corrections processes. And we do have very general training, as we have received today in this webinar, but specialized training on child physical and sexual abuse victims, on sexual assault and rape victims, on the impact of crime on homicide family survivors. So learning about the range of impact and the unique aspects depending on the type of victimization, I think becomes very important. It's also important to be aware of local, state, and national victim services and who they are and what they do. You have system-based services in law enforcement and courts and to some degree in corrections that work with victims throughout the process, but you also have community-based services that do that and also provide a lot of services to victims, including those who never ever report crimes. And they do things like support groups, and they do things like being able to do safety planning with victims. So to be able to identify all of these types of victim services and to be able to get training on crime-specific topics. If you have an interest in rape or sexual assault, we can link you up with folks who can train you either through webinars or on-site to learn more about specific types of crime victims. Next slide, please. The other thing is victim assistance professionals. I cannot tell you how much they could benefit from training about the range of different corrections programs and services, ranging from pretrial to probation, parole, and reentry. As I mentioned earlier, the different services and the different services and how they are different, really important is to be able to understand what do you do with offenders to help them not commit crimes again. What do you do with offenders to make sure that the victim's safety to the degree possible is upheld? There's a lot of interest in learning about what community corrections does with offenders, and also I think training for victim assistance professionals, that's where you can really start talking about partnerships that we will discuss in a few minutes. Through my work on justice reinvestment and corrections reform with the wonderful Pew Center on the State's Public Safety Performance Project, I have learned a fact that is very shocking to me, but it's something that we could pretty easily address. And that is that the vast majority of victim assistance professionals and nearly all the survivors in the more than 15 states I've worked with, they don't know about risk and needs assessment. And those of you on this webinar clearly know that evidence-based risk assessment tools are a big part of how we decide what to do with offenders, how we decide which offenders need to go to secure facilities versus those who can be supervised in the community. So it's really important that you be able to discuss your risk and needs assessment process with crime victim advocates. And your wonderful cheat sheet reference is the Public Safety Performance Project has a very brief document called Risk Assessment 101 that talks about risk assessment and how the data from risk and needs assessments are used in making decisions about offenders. You can also make this, I encourage you to make it very personal to your jurisdiction depending on the risk assessment instrument that you use. And I would also suggest that if you just go to the Public Safety Performance Project, we have guiding principles for crime victims when we're talking about corrections reform and lots of good resources that may be of interest to you all. Victim advocates also love to know about the range of offender programs that we do to hold them accountable and to hopefully prevent further criminal activity. So to be able to give them a little bit of a tutorial and, as I said earlier, kind of get their input on what we could be doing differently, what we could do better to improve those programs. Victims and advocates are just they're very, very concerned and very highly support things that prevent further victimization, and that's a really important thing when we're talking about your training for victim assistance professionals. And increasingly in community corrections agencies, there are policies and protocols that are specific to crime victim assistance and safety. An example is protocols that you would have to assist domestic violence victims with safety planning is a good example. So explaining to them what your policies are, and again helping them, engaging them in reviewing your policies to make sure they're the very best that they can be. And next slide, please. So this takes us to partnerships, and I want to really emphasize I'm not calling this collaboration because we collaborate a lot, but collaborations aren't permanent. We are at a point, and after 40 years of the victim assistance field and a zillion years of community corrections, we need to look at forging partnerships between victim assistance and community corrections that aren't fly-by-night, that are very much standardized, and that are really come down to formal agreements on how we can best serve victims and how we can hold offenders accountable. So think about the word partnerships as we go through this final segment. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry. Okay. You can partner to address the most important needs of crime victims. We've given you just a touch today about what those needs are, but recognizing that every victim is going to be unique and every case is going to be unique. You can partner to explain what the sentence or what the parole decision means. And I can't tell you how many victims who, if they're lucky enough to get a copy of the sentence or get a copy of the parole decision, they read it and it's like a foreign language to them. So partnering to explain what this means, partnering to explain in reentry what we're going to do when this person gets in the community, that we're going to have supervision and programming, that becomes very, very important. It's important that you partner to explain any conditions of community service and community supervision, and this could be things like community service, like payment of legal financial obligations, very important to victims, stay-away orders and protective orders, that victims understand and victim advocates are able to explain what these conditions mean. And we've already talked about making sure that the victim knows how to contact a supervising officer or someone in your agency 24/7, 365. And most of them aren't going to be calling you in the middle of the night, but to have that contact information is very comforting to crime victims. Next slide, please. We can also partner to make sure that victim input is received. And the reason I stress this is that in community corrections, you can call the victim and the victim is not home when you leave a message, and the victim doesn't call you back because they're traumatized. And you can check the box that says, I tried to reach the victim. To me, that's very good effort, but it's not good enough. We want to make sure that we're hearing from victims. And as I said earlier, it's not just to validate their experience, but the information they give us is just really, really can be very helpful for effective offender management. We can partner, as I mentioned, in states like New York and states like West Virginia to do collaborative safety planning for any victim who has identified concerns about personal security. And that may be a domestic violence victim talking to his or her advocate at a shelter, and it may be you in community corrections identifying the needs because you're asking the right questions. You should not have to do safety planning by yourself. We have amazing victim advocates who are quite expert at doing that and would love to partner with you on this important victim's rights. We can also partner to help victims prepare for and attend any of the hearings that they have the statutory or constitutional right to do so. And as I said earlier in this presentation, it can be very traumatizing for victims to have to attend a hearing where they once again are coming face to face with the offender who they may not have seen for quite some time. So to be able to prepare them and tell them what's going to happen and try to make them feel as safe as possible, that is something, a beautiful thing that advocates and community correction folks can do together. Obviously, make sure that victims are aware of rights and services. And the last one I'm going to talk about for a second. Confidentiality is, I think, something that has been a barrier between community corrections and victim services. And in a lot of community corrections agencies, there is a belief that they can't tell the victim anything about the offender in the case based upon law and agency policies. And in a number of states, I've actually taken folks through a kind of fun process. If you put victim folks on one side and community corrections folks on the other, and have them list what you can tell victims, the lists become very, very different. So it ends up meaning you have to look at your agency policies and look at your state laws, and the end result is that you can tell victims a whole lot more than you think you can. Of course, you cannot tell them things related to HIPAA. You can't tell them very often about participation results in offender programming, but you can tell them about the status of the offender. You can tell them why they aren't receiving their restitution. And we need to be looking at not the things we can't tell victims because of this and that, but really be open to thinking about what is the type of information we can tell victims. And anyone who's interested in going through that process, please contact me directly, because it's one of my favorite things to do in jurisdictions where we work with both community corrections and victim advocates. And next slide, please. And if you end up developing strong partnerships that are permanent, that are not just, as I said earlier, a 90 days or half a year thing, really good partnerships can end up helping community corrections agencies develop guiding statements and goals that are very victim-centered. Mission statements for your agency that actually have the word crime victim in them. I always get really excited when I see that. And survivors and advocates can really help you look at your agency guiding statements and goals and really help you develop ones that pay attention to the fact that your agency considers victims a client. Really important also is to be able to develop interagency policies and MOUs among probation, parole, reentry, all community corrections, and victim assistance agencies that clarify your very different but your very important respective roles in victim assistance. There are a number of community corrections agencies that have victim advisory committees, and I remember 25 years ago advising a bunch of chief probation officers that they should consider doing victim advisory committees, and one said, you know, I don't want a victim advisory committee because they're just going to tell me everything that I'm doing wrong and how everything that I'm doing is not very helpful to victims. And I asked the group, don't you want to know that? And it ended up leading to a kind of productive discussion about, yes, you want to know what you can do better, and there's no one better than survivors and advocates who can really help you think through. It's usually very simple processes about how you can improve your programs and services. Working with victims also, I think, and creating strong partnerships can help you deliver really good victim offender programming, ranging from impact of crime on victims classes to batter intervention programs, to victim offender dialogue programs, to some states now have apology banks where offenders can write apologies to their victims, and the victim chooses to receive that apology. That's processed through the correctional agency. So you really can't do good victim offender programming without victim advocates. I would encourage you to think about that. And we've talked earlier about the delivery of ongoing cross-training, that it's something we do not just once a year, but with technology now it's pretty easy to pull together a webinar where we can share information through our fabulous strong partnerships among victim advocates and community corrections. And Carrie, I'm going to give it back to you before we do your big finale.
Okay, thank you so much, Ann. We have received a couple of questions throughout the presentation, so we'll take a few minutes and I'll pose those for Ann's response. The first is, any suggestions on communicating with the domestic violence victim who asserts a religious-based belief that she is required to be submissive to her husband? I have experienced this and found it challenging to address power and control issues without challenging her religious beliefs.
Yeah. I think part of that, it's a really good question, is to learn as much as you can about that person's faith. And I've done this with victims too. I have actually studied their faith, where their interpretation is that they must be submissive, and my interpretation, and you can look at things like the Bible and the Quran, you can find different interpretations of that person's faith. The other thing that you can do is work with victim advocates and work with multi-faith communities to help them better understand some of these things that victims see as barriers to reporting, to participating. Certainly a problem is thinking that they deserve to be beaten. Work with faith communities so that they can promote a greater understanding that I don't know of any faith that says that a woman or a child deserves to be beaten. So including them in your partnerships, I think, is very, very helpful.
Excellent. Okay, and another question that we have received regarding the right to be present at revocation hearings. This person says, I assume you're referring to the victim of the original crime. Is this a federal law? I will look up what my state's laws are, but I'm wondering if this is provided for at the federal level.
At the federal level, victims, I'm trying to think with the Justice for All Act, I believe they would have the right to attend a revocation hearing, and I can actually I want to confirm that and get back to you. Maybe, Carrie, we can post that with the slides later. But the question is really good, because in a lot of states, victims of the offense that resulted in the revocation have that right. But in some states, the victims of the original offense that resulted in the original criminal conviction also has that right. So it's very important. I would send you to victim law, but to also be very, very aware of your state's law, because there may be more than one victim who has the right to attend that hearing, and there may be more than one victim who's interested in attending that hearing.
Great, thank you, Ann. Here's one more question that's come in, and this person wants to know, where can I obtain a list of specific information that can be given from the offender's probation officer to a victim in the state of Virginia? So we're looking for specific information that can be shared with victims in the state of Virginia.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question, Carrie.
This person is wanting a list of specific types of information that can be shared by the offender's probation officer to a victim in the state of Virginia.
Oh. Okay, I got you. That probably doesn't exist, because I haven't been in Virginia yet, but there is a process that, again, I would encourage anyone to email me. My email is going to be at the end here, and I can send you an example of one or two of the states where I've been in, and the process that we went through, but also in neighboring state to Virginia, what they determined under their state law you could and could not tell the victim. It's a really good starting point, and I'm very happy to share that information, because, as I said earlier, you always think that you can't share a lot of information, and it comes down to very little that you really can't share with the victim. But you need to go through that process with victim advocates. And I don't want to say it's a fun process, but I always enjoy doing it, because then you can be very, very clear with victims, not only what you can share, but why you can't share certain information because of things like HIPAA. And why victims, just as we tend to protect some victim information because of law, why we don't share that information with the offender. So it kind of goes both ways.
Okay, and we have time. We've got a lot of questions rolling in, but we just have time for one more question during this broadcast. But what we can do is, again, we'll have contact information at the end of this presentation, where any questions that went unanswered can be sent to either Ann or myself, and we'll try to respond to those as best we can. But one last question. Do we have any sample letters of that are victim-friendly, that are currently being used by probation, parole, and other community corrections agencies and or officers that are sent along with case notification? So do we have sample letters that that might be used in other jurisdictions that you could recommend, Ann?
Yeah, I would. There's actually two sources. One is to go to the Savin online community that I talked about earlier, into the virtual library. There's just tons of great resources there. But there's also the APPA. If you go to their website, there's a book called The Victim Role and Offender Reentry. And it's a couple of years old. We're actually updating it now with support from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. But in the Victim Information and Notification chapter, I believe there's a couple of good sample letters. And again, y'all are going to have my email. If you need help in developing those letters, I'm really more than happy to do so.
Well, thank you so much.
I'm glad you want to do that. I'm so excited that someone wants to do a good letter.
Thank you so much, Ann. Thanks for all of the information you've provided us today. There's clearly so much that community corrections officers can do to provide support and assistance to those who are victimized by crime, and the information and advice that you've offered today will, I think, be really helpful to all of the participants today. So thank you on behalf of APPA. Just as we close, I want to talk about a couple of additional resources that APPA has that may be of interest and use to those who are on the webinar session today. This event is actually presented as part of a project that APPA has with the Office for Victims of Crime. And so we've been able through this project to develop a range of different resources on victims' issues and concerns and rights within the community corrections context. One set of resources that will be available very soon on APPA's website is a series of 8 fact sheets that are all on a number of different issues related to victim services in community corrections. You can see a listing of the different fact sheets that are available, that will be available through this project, and will be posted to the APPA website, hopefully within the coming weeks. In addition, we've also developed some training programs that will also be available very soon through APPA's website. The first is an online lesson on the role of community corrections in victim services. So a lot of the types of information that we've discussed today is available will be available in a distance learning or a distance training program. So please watch for our website for announcements of the availability of that project, or that training program, excuse me. In addition, we've developed a very comprehensive training curriculum package that will also be available soon. And this curriculum package is designed for a 2-day classroom-based training program. The package includes instructors' manuals, participant manuals, presentation slides, and handouts. So it can be quite a resource for jurisdictions wanting additional training on victim services within their community corrections programs. So that will also be available very, very soon. In addition, as we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is the first of a series of 3 webinars, all on victim-related topics within community corrections contexts. Following today's webinar session, APPA will present an additional webinar on enhancing restitution collection and management in probation and parole. That one will be held on Wednesday, February the 6th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And as Ann mentioned in her presentation today, there's just so much interest in enhancing restitution collection and management within community corrections programs across the country, as this is such a core right that is unfortunately not been one that has been implemented as effectively as some of the other rights that victims have. So there's a lot of momentum, I think, around the country on enhancing restitution collection for the benefit of victims. So please tune in for this webinar. It will give you some both policy and practice tips to be able to do that within your own community. The third webinar session will be held on February the 27th, again from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic for that webinar will be When the Offender is a Victim, Community Corrections Response to Prison Rape. So we'll be talking about the issue of corrections-based sexual abuse and how probation, parole, and other community corrections professionals really should be aware of the Prison Rape Elimination Act and its its impact for community corrections, and the ability to respond to disclosures of victimization by individuals on supervision. So I hope you will register and tune in for that webinar as well. And with that, I'd like to close by thanking all of the participants for being a part of today's webinar session on the role of community corrections in serving victims of crime. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, a recording of this webinar will be made available online in the coming weeks, so please watch the APPA website for information and for the recorded version of the webinar. Thank you again for your participation, and I'd like to conclude today's session. Thank you, everyone.